Way it's pushed. Right.
And how long is this supposed to be? 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or an hour?
Yeah, about 45 minutes
Okay.
or an hour. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our first parlor talk of the summer.
Yay.
You can tell it's summer out there, buddy. Woo. Hi. My name is Pam Morris. I work for the Corsound Waterfowl Museum. Our fearless leader, Karen Packer, is at Harkers Island right now with our Marine Science Academy kids. So she'll be back when she gets through with those guys. And I'd like to introduce our illustrious speaker, Joel Hancock, from Harkers Island, North Carolina, who's going to speak to you about his book, Education of an Island Boy. And I have it. It's a wonderful book. If you don't have it, you should go right straight downstairs and get it. You can get it signed for you and everything. What I know about it is Joel had a blog by this same name I read pretty regularly. And I believe, Joel, I'm speaking for you, this book is a result of those musings, if you will, on the blog. Very interesting stuff. He's also authored another book, Strengthened by the Storm, which is about Harkers Island and people with faith who, I guess, established things back then. And as you're leaving, we have some waters. If you want one, raise your hands. Anybody want a water? Okay. Well, these papers are under the basket there and tells about the rest of our series for the summer, so you can look up who's going to be here on what day. Okay? All right. Well, I'll turn it over to Joel then.
Pam, thank you. I know you're not going to stay because you've heard it all before. Is that right?
Oh, I'm going to be behind the camera.
Thank all of you for being here. I'm really flattered that so many of you come, especially the places that I recognize and so many that have been a part of the education of Island Boy over the years. My wife Susan is with me, and I appreciate the museum giving me this opportunity to be here. I've had several opportunities. The book actually was published the 1st of December, and I've had several opportunities since then to speak at places and groups. And in most of those, I've tried to stay pretty close to the title, explaining that the education of the Island Boy is the education I got before I went to college, rather than afterwards, when I came to realize the things that I had already learned that have affected me and still affect me and stuff. Today, I actually would like to start with just a little bit of that and then just move into some of the stories and let the stories speak for themselves. The title comes from, as I said, from the fact that when I left for college in August of 1970, my dad was at the landing. He'd been shrimping. He had done the daylight tow and was there. And my sister was getting ready to take me up to East Carolina. I was going to play football at East Carolina. And when I went down, Daddy was in the cockpit of his boat with a cullen moored in front of him, harvesting what he'd caught that morning. And when he saw me, he stood up, and I can appreciate now better than I could then. It took him a few steps to straighten up as he walked towards me. And as he walked towards me, I said, Daddy, I'm getting ready to leave. My sister's going to take me to Greenville. And as he put his arms around me and did what was the normal show of affection for his generation, he smelled my neck. That was the ultimate show of affection. And then he said, well, son, where is it you say you're going? Now, that may seem strange to the generation I came of parents and how we were involved. But my father's generation of men on the island, they had this axiom that their responsibility to the children was shirt on your back, shoes on your feet, a roof overhead, something to eat. And nurturing was for mothers and sisters and aunts and stuff. Now, my daddy did a lot more than that, but that's why he hadn't been involved in me determining where I was going to go, especially not how I was going to pay for it. And by the way, that was 1970. If you'll think back, that was in the middle of the Vietnam era. And there were boys leaving Harkers Island all the time, but not to go to East Carolina. My brother Telford left a few months later and ended up in Vietnam. But be that as it may, as I was saying goodbye, he said, everybody needs an education. And I thought about it. Then, and a whole lot more since, I already had an education. Those 18 years of growing up on the island, around my parents, my brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, and the people who frequented the island, for a mile in each direction, and even more than that, I knew everybody that was in every house. And because of no air conditioning, windows were always open, I know what they were cooking when you would walk by. And so I was really the last generation that came of age for which the television did not dominate evening entertainment and interaction. For us in our neighborhood, it was in any of the temperate weather, you sat on a porch and old people told stories. And I was fortunate enough, and still thank the Lord, that I was able to enjoy those stories and remember some of them because I've told them so many times or had them retold. They became part of our everyday life. People could refer to stories and assume that you knew the story. They didn't have to give you the details. The point made by the story was evident when they said, it's like, I love you more than Mart loved Tom Tom. Everybody knew how much Mart loved Tom Tom, and so that was an expression of affection. There were 100 other stories that way. So what I wanted to do was to share some of those stories. I want to read one at first that would relate that most of you might already know something about, and then I want to read another one at the end. But in the meantime, I like to tell some stories. I made a note to myself as Barbara came in. Her mother, Gretchen Guthrie, wrote a book called Carteret Love Song. How long ago was that? It must have been 50 years or more, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is.
But it was about her family and heritage on Diamond City, the same people that I tell about in the opening chapters of my book. And I want to thank people like I mentioned Gretchen and David Merle. Do you remember David as well? And Shannon Adams there now that tell the story of Diamond City. And I'm sure there's others telling the story of Salter Path and of Broad Creek and of Marshallburg, these places that were both largely populated by the people that left the banks. Elida Willis used to tell me that the name Promised Lander was meant first as a pejorative. She said that the natives of Moorhead would see those people coming from the banks with their stuff loaded on skiffs, even their houses between two skiffs, and say, well, there they come, they look like the children of Israel looking for the Promised Land. She also pointed out that there's no D on Promised Land. It's just promise, not without the D. But anyway, those were the people that left the banks, and those were the people that around whom I grew up. Now, my generation was the first generation, again, for whom those were stories rather than memories. We had to be told them. But we were told, and we're told them often. So I want to start with a story that was before I was born, but it was still very much alive when I came about. And it's the story of the Boughat. Graydon Paul in Beaufort. Do you remember that, Chuck? He used to tell that story every time he'd get on that bus and tell about the Boughat. But the Boughat, it relates to an incident in 1923 when a rum runner called the Venture ran aground. Well, didn't run aground, but did it. It actually thought it was being chased by a Coast Guard cutter, and they were carrying a cargo of rum headed from the Bahamas up to New York. And so they dumped it in bags inside the hook of the Cape with a buoy, planning on coming back the next morning to get it up. But before they did, Harkers Island fishermen with a purse seine had pulled it all to the shore. And in the poem or song that Graydon Paul used to sing, it tells about how they come running from the island and all over to take advantage. This was during Prohibition. That's why it was illegal. And so my story, some people think almost that it is fictional. It's been made up. They've told so many stories about it. But I grew up around people. My daddy was 14. He remembered it. My Uncle Louis was in his 30s, and I want to tell his story. I'd like to read that for you. My father was 14 at the time and vividly remembers the real thing. My Uncle Louis, who died in 1985 at the age of 95, not only recalled the event, but he was one of those who had enjoyed the full Boughat experience. One of the stories he loved most to relate was how he, then in his early 30s, gathered his own cache of booty left by the rum runners. Like many of the islanders, Big Buddy had scurried to get to the Cape as soon as he heard from his neighborhood friend, Clayton Guthrie Sr., that some lucky fisherman had hauled in a net full of whiskey. Along with Clayton and his Uncle Danky, they dropped everything they were doing and made for the banks. In a little boat, the Best Bug, by the way, it had a two-stroke, 4-horsepower motor, air-cooled motor. They hurried across Back Sound and into Banks Bay and onto the shores of Diamond City. He knew the area like the back of his hand, for old Pa had fishing camps there near where the family's homestead had been before the storm and exodus a generation later. The spot was practical as well as convenient. Once they landed, it was a half-mile walk across the banks to the Cape shore where burlap sacks full of liquor now lay washed in the surf under the late fall sun. This was about the best scavengers could hope for, since it was a full decade before there was an inlet between Shackleford and Core Banks. A boat trip all the way down the banks toward Fort Macon Channel and back east to the Hook, or Lookout Bight, as it was called, would have taken so long as to be impractical. So still further, the cargo of the adventure was illegal, and that's why it had been dumped overboard in the first place. Loading and hauling the stuff back through Beaufort Inlet and under the nose of local, state, and federal officers would have been foolhardy even for the rugged and carefree watermen of the era. But the most compelling reason for the straight-shot route that necessitated walking across the banks was that neither Big Buddy nor most of the other pillagers had sufficient fuel to make only the shortest of excursions. In fact, it was customary when time was of no concern for fishermen and sailors on the island lucky enough to have a gas engine to power their rig, to turn off their motors and hoist a sail whenever possible, just to save the precious fuel. So substituting a 15-minute walk for a 2-hour boat trip was no great concession. Arriving at the shoreline of Diamond City, they found the bay at the hook of the Cape, as Lookout Bight was often called, already crowded with boats and many others who had come to Banks with the same intention they had. In fact, Big Buddy would often remark the trip across was like a parade, as an ever-increasing flotilla headed in the general direction of the Cape, either to claim their share of the booty or just to watch others do the same thing. The Best Bug was left anchored far enough offshore to assure that he wouldn't be stranded by an ebbing tide, and the eager young threesome ran swiftly off and across the banks and through the sand dunes. As they made it to the Cape shore, they found a veritable circus as the throng rummaged through the strewed bags and sacks to find just the exact cash they were looking for. Louis and his companions picked up the first 2 unopened cases they could find and headed swiftly back northward toward their boat. About halfway back, Danky decided to open the sacks to inspect and even sample what they had collected. To their disappointment, they saw that they had picked up containers of quartz rather than the pints that they had supposed. They much preferred the smaller bottles. They were easier to hide. So they immediately decided to leave the bags right there where they were and return to the shore and get what they'd wanted in the first place. So large had been the stash that even by the time they returned, there was plenty to choose from. This time they made sure they had the right size bottles, and once again they headed for their boat. Within less than an hour, they were back aboard the Best Bug. But to their disgust, they learned that their boat had been relieved of its fuel supply, most likely by one of their fellow travelers who had come along without checking that he had enough for the round trip. Do any of you remember that sometimes people would just use a jug full of gas and just run a hose into it to feed their motors? That's right. If necessity is the mother of invention, it can also be the midwife of improvisation. Having sampled the whiskey in the quart bottles just minutes earlier, Big Buddy noted that it was the strongest whiskey he'd ever tasted. If alcohol can be used to light a flame, he thought, why can't it be used to run an engine? Thus began the experiment with the combustive powers of distilled liquor. With Danky at the helm, Big Buddy held the thumb over the open mouth of the bottle of Caribbean rum and allowed it to seep in the downdraft carburetor of a 6-horsepower Bridgeport engine. Sure enough, the engine fired up, perhaps from the residue of gas left in the fuel line. But as the trio made their way back across the sound toward the island, the motor held its fire and never cut off completely, not once. Uncle Louis stood at the back of the engine holding the bottle. He could feel and smell the exhaust as it fumed from the straight iron pipe that extended from the manifold. He said that he positioned himself so that the exhaust vapor would blow directly into his face. He did so, insisted, because it was the sweetest fumes he'd ever smelled in his whole life. So they made it back with their booty, except for 2 bottles that they had been obliged to use to open the fuel for the engine. Big Buddy never found out who had stolen his gas tank that day, and really didn't much care to investigate. But he never forgot how he had improvised to make it home, nor the smell that lifted the pistons of that internal combustion motor as it putted across back sound. The booze yacht was much more than a legend to him and those of us who've heard him tell his stories. It was just another part of what life was like on the early days of Harkers Island. So that's one example of the type of stories. Now, I mentioned that these stories don't necessarily run together in a straight line. They're more of a tapestry than a picture or a portrait. And I also mentioned that for many of the stories, it's better to read them out loud so that you can get the true feel of it. The first 2 chapters of the book are about leaving the Banks and coming to the island. Then I tell the story of my grandparents, both of whom had been born on the Banks, and of my parents who raised their 10 children on it. I do that to give a context to the other stories, such as the one that I read there. Now, the rest of these stories I want to tell, except for one final one, that will tell you something about what life was like on the island. There was a man on the island 20 years older than my daddy who was a good friend named Jimmy Starn. Starn. And he was one of my father's closest friends. Beyond that, what I know most about him, based upon the stories I was told as a child, was that he loved the actress Marlene Dietrich. There was a movie theater on the island which we called a show house. And they showed movies on Thursday and Friday night, the same show, and then a different one on Saturday night. The one on Thursday, Friday might be 25 years old, and the one on Saturday might only be 10 years old. But they waited for, he loved Marlene Dietrich movies, and more to the point, he loved the characters portrayed by that German starlet. One Saturday night, Jimmy Stein with several of his friends, including my daddy, went to the theater to see a new movie to them starring Marlene Dietrich. That evening they sat together and watched as the character played by one of their favorite actors came to an untimely end at the end of the movie. Jimmy was visibly upset, and as he walked home, Daddy said he kept looking down and saying, "Why did she have to die?" Daddy and the other assumed that Jimmy's depression would wane as the night drew on. But this time their friend carried the movie with him well into the evening. The next morning, word reached my father that when he got home, still fretting from the movie's outcome and needing an outlet for his disappointment, Jimmy Stein systematically pulled out the family's plates, bowls, and saucers and then broke every dish in the house. That's just one of the dramas that were played out growing up on Harkers Island. A couple other short ones. That first generation that left in 1899, almost all of them were gone by 1901. The 1890 census showed only 80 people on the island and 800 on Shackleford Banks. The 1900 census showed 1,000 people on Harkers Island and nobody on the Banks. That's how quick the exodus had been. When I was growing up, you were always aware of the people who had actually lived on the Banks, as opposed to those who had children and stuff. And the last one that anyone remembered was Mary Willis. She had come across when she was 14 years old. And she moved to the south side of the island where you looked across to the Banks, where almost everybody did, where they could work and see where their families had been. But Mary was soon married, and she never had an opportunity to go back to the Banks. Men did because they were fishing there, working the water, going across the Cape. Mary never did. She said that she would sometimes go look at the Banks and yearn for it, but there was just, she soon had a husband and children, no reason to go back. And then finally, when she was in her 80s, her son asked her if she wanted to go back to the Banks one more time. Now, by then, this would have been in the 70s, and it would have been a whole lot different. But he set her on what the thought of the boat in that little skiff, and they headed across it's about 2.5 miles as they got into Banks Bay. And as she went into the marshes, her sonny Willie Guyan said that as they got into marshes, she told him to stop the boat. And as it slowed down, she stood up and took a really deep breath, and then looked at Willie Guyan and said, "Hon, don't that horse piss smell good?" I don't know, have you all experienced that? My kids, when they come home, the first thing they do when they get these Carter Corners told, roll down the windows. They want to smell the marshes. Of course, at the Banks, the marsh had an even more distinctive aroma and stuff. But Mary Willis knew what it was like to be coming home. When she died, there's a story in the News Times about her. She was 102 when she died. Now, I spoke to a group in Beaufort yesterday, ladies, a book club there, and I was telling them about my main experience growing up in Beaufort was when my father would take us to Beaufort in the boat, and we'd walk across he would walk across a range of boats that were tied together by the dock there where the grocery store was and the feed store and stuff was. And my daddy would hold me in his arms, and it amazed me that, you know, the way he could maneuver himself, sometime with two of us in his arms going in. He would always wait till a boat left and he could get all the way to the dock before he let Mama get up on the dock. By the way, I mentioned growing old, the two things I miss the most, one is my names evade me. I see people and tell you their life story, tell you their parent, and I can't tell you their name. And the other thing is balance. I used to, well, put it this way, if I go to a ball game and there's bleachers, I had to either sit at the bottom or stand up and watch. But anyway, my dad would take us there. And what I remember most, that he would take me to the barber shop there. And I remember there was a black man there who was shying shoes. It was right by Lipman's store. Who was it? It was the barber. Chuck, do you remember? But I remember that Clem Woodard, the basketball hero, worked there too. Anyway, that's what I remember most. But on the island, we had 3 barber shops, and all 3 of them were run by my daddy's cousins. But the main one on the island was called Louis's barber shop, and he had a speech impediment, but everybody loved Louis. He was such a loving character, and that was where we would go generally on Saturdays, and you'd wait in line to get a haircut. My brother would actually make money by selling his place in line. You know, he could get enough for his haircut by selling that place. But that's one place where you were there perhaps with your father, but usually just older brothers, but your mother and sisters weren't there. So you heard stories that you wouldn't have heard anywhere else, and stories you couldn't tell when you got home to your mother and stuff. It was a place for boys to mature a little bit. But there were hundreds of stories told, and it was there that there was a guy on the island whom they called Lying Willie. Now, everybody told stories that, like Mama said, they may be a lie, but it was told for the truth. Willie was different from the others. If he told a big yarn, he carried on to the very end that it was real, that it was true. He never let on, even though it was so far out it couldn't possibly have been true. Others would tell stories and then laugh at the end, and that's why they called him Lying Willie. He told those stories all the time. And one of them particularly pointed out some of the characteristics of life on the island. He said that one, and I heard this myself, sitting at the foot while he was talking to Louis and the other people, the one in the barber chair. He said that in one spring there hadn't been a lot of loons. Now, some of you may relate to the fact that Harkers Islanders love to not just shoot loons, but to eat loons. But there hadn't been a lot of loons, and so he took his boat and skiff and went across to Banks Bay, thinking that loons might be flying closer to the tide line on the banks than on the island. And so he got in a marsh and waited, and eventually he saw coming from the westward several loons in a line that he could recognize, and he thought real quick. He said he took the shell out of his gun and cleared the balls out, and took his pocket knife out and broke the blade off and put that where the shot had been in the shell. And then he waited, he said, till the loon got right in line with a oyster rod, and fired that gun. And he said that it cut the loon's neck and then opened half a bushel of oysters. Well, those things, like my mom said, that don't bear telling. But for Lion Willie, that was just one of the many type stories that he would tell. As I said, the barbershop was a place for getting some of the education that you might not get from your mama or your aunts and uncles. Here's one. My grandmother had a sister who was how would we describe it? She weren't all there. Have you ever heard that expression? She weren't quite all there. She never got married, and eventually she was overweight. Daddy, we used to say she was just as thick as she was tall. But on the island, to introduce this, I said, anyone who lived on the island before the days of thermostatically controlled heat and air conditioning recall the sound of seagulls in the morning. Fishermen would come into the dock in the morning, and as they would cull their fish and throw them up, the seagulls would swoop down. And so with windows open, because there was no air conditioning, you could hear the seagulls 100 yards inshore or more. But then you could tell when there was a big harvest because there were more gulls there. And so we began to use, everybody was familiar with that, and so they would use expressions like soaring like a gull, hungry as a gull, mouth as wide open as a gull. Lots of other similes were parts of our lexicon. For that reason, when my Aunt Mary one day made such an allusion, to her exasperation, she was tactfully described as simple, and she grew older. My father would say she was just as wide as she was long. She also could be loud and opinionated, and it was often heard protesting what she thought were the injustices in her life. The combination of her simplicity, her appearance, and especially her frequent and outlandish protestations served to make her somewhat of a comical feature to those of us who knew her best and who were around her the most. She never married. She spent her entire life in the care of her parents. During the lean years of the Great Depression and beginning with the social services that most of us now take for granted, Mary learned that the local welfare office was offering handouts to those who were in dire need. Along with many others, she stood in the line at the county courthouse in Beaufort for the chance to explain her predicament, hopefully get some food or other supplies that were going to be handed out for free. Unfortunately for Aunt Mary, because she had no dependents and lived with the home of her parents, when the time came to make her case, she was deemed unqualified to receive any kind of assistance. Obviously disappointed and just as much frustrated, she rose from the desk where she had been interviewed. Turning around and making her way to the exit, she was obliged to stand face to face with a long line of others who were awaiting their own chance to explain why they needed help. Having already told the interviewer in graphic terms how she felt about his decision, she now placed her hand on her hip, and this is how my mama would do it, leaned a little to the side, and then hollered at all those who were standing between her and the doorway. Just look at you, crowd. You look like a bunch of damn gulls. Let me one more story, and then a couple of real short ones. There is a place on the island when you come on off the bridge, a really sharp turn at Red Hill called Dead Man's Curve. It was tallest oak trees on the island there, and there were no street lights or anything. There weren't even lines on the road. And so as soldiers there during the war and afterwards, there were often wrecks, especially if they had been drinking and stuff, and so they called it Dead Man's Curve. Now, in my youth, there was a song by Jan and Dean called Dead Man's Curve. Do you remember that, Richard? It was partly written by Brian Wilson, who passed away this week. Weekends in the 50s and 60s when first servicemen were there were often accidents there. And one such accident was witnessed by my good friend Livingston Brooks, the one we called Lib. He was about your age, I think, Richard. He and his father were there even before a lone North Carolina patrol officer arrived to investigate and make his report. And here's what Lib said happened. He said, after an ambulance had removed the seriously injured driver from the crash and sped away with lights flashing towards the closest hospital in Morehead City, the trooper retired to his squad car to prepare his report. In the warm summer air, he was quietly discussing with some of the onlookers what they first heard and later observed as they arrived on the scene. It was while engaged in that someone noticed that asleep in the back seat of the officer's car was an older man wearing handcuffs, who apparently inebriated had been picked up by the patrolman just before he was called to respond to the accident at Red Hill. As the backseat passenger awoke, he grew increasingly restless and uncomfortable. Not fully aware of where he was and why he was locked up in the back of a patrol car, "What is it?" he began to ask. "Where am I? What's going on?" was all he could say as he looked toward the officer and saw the flashing lights from atop the car, reflecting on the surroundings. Still focused on the incident at hand, the officer paid him scant attention, but eventually turned in his direction to say simply, "It was a really bad accident." Still more confused and curious, the detainee immediately followed up asking, "Well, who was it?" The officer paid even less attention, then before simply responding, "It was some drunk." Now totally alarmed and extremely agitated, the prisoner shouted, "Oh me, was I hurt?" Now, before I get this, my Uncle Louis he was 18 years older than my daddy and lived next door, just like my Uncle Tommy was 17 years older than me and lived next door. So my children felt my older brother was almost like a grandfather to them, and so it was with my father's brother. I had lost my grandfather when I was 5 years old. He was like a grandfather to me. He was very much part of our life, and he and my daddy were together every day. And when I came back from East Carolina, and to move back to the island, I was looking for a job. And when I came back that afternoon, my daddy and my uncle had strung rope from an oak at the landing to an oak at the road, and were hanging net all the way along the back for mullet season that was about to start. And I went up to report to Daddy what had happened. And when I did, my Uncle Louis asked me where I'd been, and I told him I'd been to look for a job. Well, then he started talking, and you knew when he started, you didn't interrupt him. And what he told about was that during World War II, news came to the island that they were building a dock at Ocracoke. And not only that, the Army they were going to pay $1 an hour for workers, which was the most anyone had ever heard of, anyone paying for labor. And so on a Sunday afternoon, he got in his boat and headed up to Portsmouth. Or it was at Portsmouth rather than Ocracoke that they were building the dock. And he got there just as the sun was going down, and as he tied his boat to the dock, and as he got up, his knee hit a nail that was exposed. Not bad, but it started bleeding. So he got back in his boat, and by about 1 or 2 in the morning, he was back to Harkers Island. And then the story finished. And I asked, I said, "Big buddies, what was the point of the story?" He said, "Oh, I forgot. That was the closest I ever come to having a job." And that was how many of the people that had never had a job in their entire life. One more about my daddy. He got married on December 31st of 1927. He was 19, and my mother had been 15 for a whole month. And because of that, she couldn't sign. She had to get the approval of her parents to sign. And my grandmother on my mother's side refused, and then my grandfather as well. But after pleading from my father, my grandfather, whom we called Old Pa Dick, who Richard is named after, said, "I'll tell you what, I ain't going to sign it, but if you can get somebody else to sign it, I won't care." 15 was young, but there were other people getting married at that age. By the time my mama was 20, she had 3 children. Yeah. But anyway, so Daddy convinced Danky, the one that Big Buddy had been with when he went to get the booze, he convinced Danky to go with him and pretend to be his father-in-law. And that worked. It was on Saturday, but the courthouse was open. And they got it. They went on the mailboat there and came on the mailboat back just as it was in December, so it got late early, to quote Yogi Bear, it got late real early. But they got home with that marriage license, so Daddy didn't want to take any chances. They walked along the shore about 200 yards to where Mart Guthrie lived. He was the justice of the peace, and Daddy went in and he was having supper and said, "I need you to marry me and need to do it right away." So Mart said, "Can you wait just a minute? We're just sitting down for supper." And Daddy said, "I'll pay you extra $5 if you do it right now." Mart said, "Hold on, here I am." And so Danky as a witness and Mart's wife as a witness, my mom and Daddy were married there. And they walked up from the shore to the store that my Daddy's father owned, Charlie Hancock store, and got a drink. And then, now again, this is December the 31st, New Year's Eve. They walked right directly across the road to where my daddy's sister Louisa, who was a widow by then, lived. And they were going to live there until they built a house, which right beside it where I grew up. So they get there, and that's their honeymoon is in that house in a side bedroom. And as I said, it was early, so I imagine they went to bed early that night on their honeymoon. Daddy said the next morning at about 6 o'clock, just as the sun was breaking through, he heard a knock on the window there of that easternmost bedroom. And when he went and opened the blinds and looked, and it was his father, "Oh, Pa." And he kept knocking. So finally he opened the window and he said, "Poppy, what do you want?" He said, "Son, you ain't going to amount to nothing if you lay in bed this late every morning." You remember what I said about my Uncle Louis about not having a job? One of the ways you could live without having a job was that you had to work every day to do something. I read that now still over half the people in the world wake up every morning with the main thing on their mind, where will I get food and water today? Well, it may not have been that urgent, but food and water for the next few days or before refrigerator stuff was on their mind every day. I grew up with what we called the icebox rather than a refrigerator and stuff. But I was very fortunate in that way. Now, before I get to this last story, is there anyone here that has any questions about what I've said or from the book or anything else about it? Yes?
I'm not from around here, so I'll ask an elementary question. When you say the banks, to what are you referring to?
Shackleford Banks. I'm sorry. Now, I mentioned that when we say the island, we're not talking about Cedar Island or Emerald Island. We're talking about Harkers Island. And when you say the banks, you're talking about Shackleford Banks. When we say the Sound, we're not talking about Core Sound, Pamlico Sound, or Straits Channel. We're talking about back Sound between the island. And people on the island can be sort of hard-nosed about that at times. They have their own names for places from Diamond City to Bell's Island to Wade Shore to Mullet Pond, which would be at the Beaufort Inlet. And they get really irked when somebody says they're going to Harkers or to the Shack. They refer this. It's the island. If you're going to shorten it, it's or Shackleford, but not that. But did that answer?
Yes, sir.
Now you say you're from off. Where from?
Western New York State.
Rochester?
Yeah. Pardon?
Rochester?
No, Dunkirk, New York, south of Buffalo.
Oh, okay. We're headed up to Palmyra with some friends in August.
It's beautiful. This time of year, it's the right time to go.
Finger Lakes, going up the Finger Lakes.
Perfect.
You say my wife has been married to me for 51 years and has lived on the island for those last 50 years. She was on the board of directors for the museum for a while. And at one of the meetings, someone was asking, one of the islanders was asking for some things, some changes they wanted. And they said, when they were refused, they said, well, no wonder, ain't nobody from Harkers Island on the board. Well, she'd been there, 50 years. Algernon Gillikin said that he got married in 1957 to a girl on the island and moved next door in a house that they got from his wife's grandmother and had been there, and this was in about 2010. He said, so I'd been on the island then for 63 years. And he made his living working in the water. He said, but right now, this would have been 63 years after he moved to the island. If I set my net in front of somebody, I'm a damn hot wear. All right, today is Juneteenth, and I have a story in my book about my first interaction with people of the black race, or we called them colored at the time, because on Harkers Island or east of Beaufort there were none after Davis Island was abandoned, and the only blacks I saw were when I came to Beaufort, and it went not until I went to East Carteret. That first year, I think there were only a couple there. Even though the Brown versus Board of Education had ordered a with all deliberate speed in 1954, and this was in 1966. But by the time I graduated, it was fully integrated, and black friends and other things. Chris Johnson, by the way, came to see me the other day. Chuck, you remember him, don't you? And he looks like he could still knock you down. I wanted to tell about the first black person that I came to know. Geographically, Harkers Island is part of the South, even the Deep South. But to that extent, that as it applies to race relations, Harkers Island in my youth was a world apart from the tobacco and cotton crescent that stretched from the Tidewater area of Virginia to the piney woods of eastern Texas. Racial stereotypes and attitudes may have been deep-seated here as in Beaufort, Newbern, or Raleigh, but on the island there was a distinction that was all very much a difference. It was as simple as it was historical. The economic patterns of the antebellum period kept the Banks communities in general, and Harkers Island in particular, apart from the plantation culture that dominated social relations elsewhere in North Carolina before and after the Civil War. In short, the absence of those plantations also meant the absence of African American communities that sprang up in and around them. That demographic pattern established before the war continued and even hardened in the following decades. Chuck, the other day, last week I met a guy, do you remember Sue Felton at East Carteret? That was her brother. And I had never put together that all those Feltons that lived in North River were named from the Felton family's big, large, well, I don't know if it was a plantation, but from his large estate and stuff. And, it just never occurred to me, that there was a correlation between Sue Felton's name and Clyde Felton's name. In some communities, Harkers Island included, there were virtually no black families. A few months before I was born, the nearest black families to Harkers Island were in North River near Beaufort. Except for Saturday's trips to Beaufort or Morehead City, I had lived nearly my entire life as a child without ever interacting with anyone of another race or color. The island that I knew was about as lily-white as one could ever imagine. But when I was 8 years old and growing into an intense love of baseball, watching it, playing it, reading it, talking about it, I came to know the first African-American man I can remember. His name was James Archie, but no one called him that. Instead, he was known to everyone simply as Mississippi, after the state he called home. He was an itinerant laborer who worked in the fish house with Henry Davis, the same as who had been my father's co-worker in the shelling of the Harkers Island roads in the 1930s. He lived in a small one-room frame building at the foot of the dock that serviced the offshore wharf and buildings. Do you all remember that docks, they used to have a building offshore and a building onshore with like a railway between them, where they would take the fish out and move them on a railway where they would be put in trucks. Well, that was Mississippi's job. And he was, well, let me describe him. He had a large round face, closely cropped hair, deep bass voice. He could have been cast as a character in the popular Broadway play of the area, Showboat. It's not hard to imagine him entertaining himself while sweating on the docks by belting out a chorus of Old Man River. But it was his sinewy physique, from his neck and his shoulders down through his arms and chest to his hips and calves, that made him well suited for lifting boxes of fish, shrimp, and clams that weighed well over 100 pounds. Richard, you'll appreciate this. They would stack those wooden fish boxes higher than your head. He could throw them so that they landed exactly where they were. You didn't have to adjust them when they got them. It was almost like throwing a cast net. All the while he was singing, whistling, or constantly talking to anyone who could hear him. Those strong arms that lifted the fish boxes could do wonders with a 36-inch baseball bat. In what some have called baseball's golden age and the heyday of Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, who were from his neighboring state of Alabama, this band called Mississippi became our very own Negro League All-Star. And with this one, we could actually watch him play rather than just read about him in the sporting news or hear about him on the radio. Fish house work was mostly in the morning and late evening when boats came in with a catch. During the day, Mississippi usually had time to come with Wayne, his friend, to the baseball field we had fashioned on a vacant pasture land mentioned previously that was directly behind the home of Johnny Willis. It was the property of a retired Methodist preacher, Carl Johnson. Because cattle once grazed there, Because cattle once grazed there after a national nominating convention held in 1964 at San Francisco's Cow Palace, some of us started calling our field Johnson's Cow Palace. We even posted a handmade sign to that effect, but that was just a tiny insignificance of the experience there. One of the things I recall most of all about baseball summers in the mid-1960s is that no matter where we were in our games, when Mississippi arrived, or when word came out that he was on his way, the excitement was palpable, and we quickly reconfigured our teams to make sure he had a place. Our field had been fashioned to the dimensions meant for lanky young boys, still filling out their bodies. those distances proved woefully inadequate when Mississippi came to the plate. He would hit the ball so hard that infielders always moved back several steps to protect themselves from on the few occasions when he hit anything other than towering fly balls that had to be retrieved from deep in the pines and yopon bushes that were our fences. Since we had only one ball, usually taped and dirty, searching for and finding it in the green thickets of early summer was not always easy. But that distraction was well worth the trouble due to the happy excitement of watching this enormous colored man hit the ball farther than we'd ever witnessed. Now, I mentioned that if some of you might remember what it was like to have a ball that had been taped so many times that it took the shape of an egg rather than, and it was dark. When we finally had a little league team, a Babe Ruth league team that Wilson Davis coached, we used to love to play Beaufort and Moorhead because they had white baseballs. To this day, a new baseball out of a ball is something like a treasure to me. I want to smell it, and it feels like a piece of peppermint candy. Chuck, does it feel that way? It feels so light that it almost wants to floating, as opposed to those balls that had been water soaked and hit with a bat that had been broken and nailed back together. Just as when we were working the dock, he was as jovial and happy as anyone could imagine. He laughed just as loud and hard as he played and worked. Unlike Annis, that was a black lady I had told about, given his age and background, he must have known firsthand the sting of racial prejudices that were the norm of that era. But he never let even on the faintest sensitivity that he was any way different or apart from the rest of us, either at the fish house or on the ball field. It was for that reason that we eventually became to feel the same way, that he was just another bigger and stronger one of us. After an initial consciousness of his distinctive color, that he was just at least to those of us of our finite group, that difference inevitably gave way to an appreciation of his person, his character, and his talents. Eventually, he went from being Mississippi the colored man to Mississippi the hard worker to Mississippi the ball player to Mississippi the friend. After that one magical summer, he was off to another fish house in some other coastal community somewhere along the Atlantic coast or Gulf Coast. As far as I can tell, no one from the island has ever heard from him, or of him again, but he remains part of the memory of at least one young boy who still marvels at recalling the sound and image of a hulking black man hitting a misshaped dark brown baseball wrapped with athletic tape. I'm glad I had that lesson as early and as profoundly as I did. It made me a better person then, especially in those later years after integration, when I would come to sit among, play beside, be taught by, work together, and be friends with African American men and women in every aspect of my life. The life lessons I had first learned, including those at Henry's Dock and at Johnson's Cow Palace, have served me well and often. Well, friends, that's what I had for the day. I appreciate that. I go on a little bit over. But anyway, thank you all for being here. And if anyone has any questions or anything, I'll be here as long as you need me. Excuse me.
I said I enjoyed every minute of that.
Oh, well, thank you.
I was raised on the Chesapeake Bay.
Really?
Yeah, right on the beachfront. And my grandfather had a small net. And my mother said to go out in the yard, and I went in. He was
So you grew up in a fishing community?
Yes. And so I got back in the house, and my mother said, "So what is Grandpa doing?" And I said, "He's crocheting." And one of those things just rang a bell for me. So.
Do I remember you?
No.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Joe?
I got
only
it.
bought this book, but I need it signed.
Okay, I got it.
I gotta get my mess off of you there.
Oh,
It's got your pocket
there's part of it
stuff
about
off.
each part of it and how we came together.
Yeah.
I mentioned in there, I mentioned how everybody.
Okay, I'll get, thank you. I was just coming to get something. Thank you.